Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Let's start off with a quote from Albert Einstein here, who once said that compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it. He who doesn't pays it. This is a remarkable quote from Einstein, and it has so much to do with today's stock market volatility and the coronavirus all working at the same time and showing what compound interest is all about, or what exponential algorithmic expediency is. Yeah, Stacy, what's up?
Max, we're thinking exponentially in this episode of Keiser Report during the exponential spread of the pandemic coronavirus. We're looking at the second half of the chessboard, as it is called. And I might want to add that today is my birthday, so turning 1 year older in the midst of an exponential pandemic, which is hitting the mortality rates go exponential as you get older, is not fun to turn a year older in the middle of a pandemic. But before we get into the exponential growth of the pandemic, let's look at the results of the exponential growth in debt over the past few decades. Keiser Report, of course, has been reporting on this nonstop for the past 10 years. And I want to look at these two charts. It's the 30-year Treasury and the price of oil. If you turn it upside down, you see the exponential. It's gone exponential down. The 30-year Treasury yield is well below 1%. The oil price, obviously, we collapsed 30% on the opening on Monday of this week.
The price of money, whether it's cash, 2-year note, 5-year note, 10-year note, 30-year note, is approaching zero. So fiat money has no value whatsoever. Gold is hitting new all-time highs in currencies everywhere in the world. It'll soon be hitting a new all-time high against the US dollar. Bitcoin is holding steady. It's holding great. It started out at $1. It's now hovering between $7,000 and $9,000 per Bitcoin. And this is the store of value, the safe havens that people are going to run to when money becomes worthless and negative rates become the norm. So money is worth less than nothing. It's worth less than the toilet paper people are hoarding. As a matter of fact, toilet paper per sheet is now worth more than $1 per sheet. In some instances, people are paying $60, $70, $80 a roll for toilet paper.
That is an exponential growth in the price of a sheet of toilet paper. That is indeed correct. And of course, I do want to remind you, we are in the middle of a pandemic in which you're supposed to wash your hands all the time and not touch your face. So please, Max, do not touch your face, or otherwise that clip will go viral. Everybody who touches their face goes viral. I want to add, because it's my birthday, Max got me something even rarer than the gold ring he got. It's the hand sanitizer. That is also in short supply. So again, that is tied to our hyper exponential growth in sort of globalization that happened. For example, it was in just 1 year that 95% of the capacity to produce face masks, medical masks, and personal protection equipment was exported to China. It happened 1 year in the last 10 years. So that was an exponential growth in the export of our jobs, but now we are left helpless in this. So on top of that, we have this exponential growth in debt that has left us very fragile. The opposite of what Nassim Taleb would say is anti-fragile. Had we had the capacity, for example, to produce our own medical equipment, our own medical supplies, our own pharmaceuticals. We don't have that. So what we have is essentially controlled and planned central bank run economy. And that is where everybody is looking for answers to a pandemic, which is just bizarre. In the past week, as this crisis was unfolding, we saw the St. Louis Fed President Bullard says credibility of central banks seems to be eroding. So comparing it again to 2008 and the 2008 crisis, when we saw gold sell off by 30% over the course of 6 months, I don't think we're going to see that this time because, as he points out, rightly so, I believe that the Fed has lost credibility. And there's nothing but faith in the sense of a fiat currency world. So I think central banks have been the biggest buyers of gold since 2008. So you have strong hands holding gold at the moment, rather than those weak hands of the hedge funds that had to sell off gold in order to meet margin positions back in 2008. So this is my instinct. I could be wrong, but this is what my instinct is telling me.
Well, yeah, people are losing faith in central banks. right? So central banks replaced every institution in society. They replaced the church, they replaced the schools, they replaced the markets with no price discovery. And so this is part of the transformation of the global economy, in particular the American economy, into what's called American market fundamentalism, where it's pure theocratic fanaticism, believing in the sanctity of the central bank. And now that's disappearing. And now prices are finding a level that reflects the true supply and demand of a genuine economy. And those prices are going to be a lot different than what we've seen in the last 30 years.
It's just bizarre to be in America and watch that this is a genuine fundamentalism. Everybody from the president to senators to Congress to legislators, everybody's expecting the Fed to rescue the entire, to stop somehow a biological event, a viral event that is spreading and killing people. And I want to bring this back to, because we've always been talking about the pandemic of money printing and the nonstop exponential growth in debt. There's been an exponential growth in debt since 2008, mostly from China, but also in the corporate sector in the United States, especially the fracking and the energy sector. I suppose that's going to blow up rapidly, but other sectors are going to blow up as well. And whether or not we can print our way out of that, I don't think so. I think you'll see intervention by the state with fiscal policies instead of monetary policies, because they'll have no choice. But in terms of the way markets can predict things, we had this spooky event, which was last summer, June, July, when we interviewed Roy Sabag here. And, negative interest rates broke all laws of the physics of finance. So we were asking him, and he's a great thinker, he runs Gold Money and Monet.com, and what he said that could possibly be the case is that negative rates were predicting a mass decline in population, a mass extinction sort of event. He didn't know whether it was going to be by choice, people would just stop having children because there was too much debt, for example, or some sort of pandemic. And it's interesting that the markets, the hive mind of the markets, saw this coming. No matter how much humans think we're above all other creatures on Earth, whether they're insects or the Amazon rainforest or creatures, the 95% of species that we wiped off the face of the Earth, the fact is we're still connected to them, and we see this coming. We have this billion-year-old instinct for survival and for what's coming. So I think we're that herd stampeding across the Serengeti.
There is no hierarchy. There is only Gaia. And Gaia is Mother Earth. And it's all one. We are all one living organism. And humans started to behave as a cancer. And so Gaia is trying to push them out of the ecosystem. And they can do this in two ways. Number one, they introduce Bitcoin, which kills all fiat money. And I believe the problem with fiat money and central banks today is the presence of Bitcoin, which is the apex predator in the universal cosmic economy. And then coronavirus is just another obvious example of Gaia depopulating planet Earth. Now, Roy Sabag intuited this, with negative interest rates. And it brings us to the 3Ds. Remember, look at the economy using your 3D goggles. Deglobalization, de-dollarization, depopulation.
I don't think it necessarily had to be that situation. I don't think that was the obvious outcome of this, but I think it was because of the exponential growth in debt that we had no choice in this. And we also were unfortunate to have Trump as president at a time where he only believes in the price of the stock market, whatever that is, and it must go up exponentially at all costs. The Fed seems to believe that as well, as do all of the bankers that they serve, because anytime the market started to correct even a little bit, they had to intervene. And all that exponential debt is also playing out in the political sector, because what exponential debt is not only did we have negative rates in which time had no value, but exponential debt was stealing from the future. And we got so far into the future, now they're trying to issue 100-year bonds, and that's like stealing generations that haven't been born. But at the moment, the boomers are definitely colliding with the Generation Z and millennials, and you see that in the political space. the choice between neoliberal status quo, Biden continue as it is, and Bernie Sanders, who wants to tear it all down and bring in, basically redistribute the wealth or redistribute at least some of the risk and all that debt, put it back on the balance sheet of the boomers from which it came. But I think this is also that collision. And in terms of political events, hyperinflation is the most political event of all. Remember in 2008, 2009, Keiser Report, we covered everybody in the gold and money sector were saying, well, is it going to be inflation or deflation with all this money printing? Some said it might be hyperinflation, but there was never that doubt, as Bullard says, that there's doubt now, there's lack of faith in the central banks. Looks as if Fed has lost control. 10-year US yields collapsed after Fed 50 basis point emergency cut, and as Fed has ramped up balance sheet. There you see when they tried to taper the Ponzi scheme last year, now they're having to expand the balance sheet. But at the same time, again, that hive mind, the bond investors never believed it. That was like, if you turn it upside down, that was exponential growth in basically the 10-year yield.
If the central banks are the cancer, they approach it like a citadel. And so they're taking all that stuff inside the citadel. And we're not yet at the point where we're declaring that victory over central banks, because they have the ability to expand their citadel exponentially. And the boomer plague, the coronavirus, it targets 60, 70, and 80-year-olds. That's a way to pass on some hope to the younger generation. Also, the boomers tend to hate Bitcoin. So here you have a pandemic of the coronavirus and the pandemic of Bitcoin, all targeting the 60, 70, and 80-year-olds. That's Gaia trying to pass the baton on to a younger, more enlightened generation.
I might add that Nassim Taleb, who I mentioned, his organization that does system risk, he says for no 50-year-olds, they should all not go outside at all.
That's Gaia for you. Of course, he's 60 or so. Anyway, stay tuned. Much more coming your way. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Steve Keen. He's the author of Debunking Economics. He's got an amazing Patreon page at Prof. Steve Keen, where you can basically become a student for much cheaper than going to any university. And we all know the universities are no good. Steve, welcome back.
Good to be here, Max. I don't like the reason, but I do like the show.
Now, let's talk coronavirus. You recently wrote that we need to start thinking exponentially in order to contain the coronavirus. Elaborate on this. What does thinking exponentially look like, Steve?
Well, it's actually a great old analogy, Max. There's two of them. One is, if you imagine you've got a lily growing on a pond, and it doubles in size every day, and if it gets to being 100% of the pond, it'll kill all life in the pond. If you get to the stage that it's 50% of the pond, how much longer have you got? One more day. So if you delay it it's not big enough yet, within the last 4 days, it'll increase by a factor of 16, and you'll be overwhelmed. Another one everybody might know is the king who has a mathematician who helps him win a battle, and he says, I'll give you anything you want. And the guy says, all I want, sire, is 1 grain of rice on the first square of a chessboard, 2 on the second, 4 on the third, etc., etc. And by the time the king gets to about the 15th square, when he thinks he has a bargain, he realizes this guy's going to take over the entire kingdom, so he has him killed. Now, that's what's going on with the coronavirus. It doubles at the moment, by the looks of things, about every 5 to 7 days, which means effectively every week there are twice as many cases. So if you get to the stage where half the world is infected after, let's say, 25 weeks, week 26, everybody's got it. And therefore, you really have to move as early as you can to slow that down. And even though it seems selfish to say, I'm going to stay away from other people, by doing that, you increase the doubling time. You make it go from, say, 1 week to 2 weeks. And that has an enormous difference on how long we have to react. And we really have to increase the doubling from somewhere in the order of a week to a month. And if we do that, we may actually be able to develop a vaccine before everybody gets the disease.
It's interesting that you say people have difficulty in conceptualizing in a exponential way a problem like this. Particularly interesting when you consider that for the past 25 years, the entire global economy, the entire global stock market has been driven by social media companies that are driven by the so-called network effect, which is the exponential growth of the network of the social media. They refer to these things as growing like viruses. And this is really defines our world, is the network effect, virus effect like growth of social media. So then we get a biological virus and suddenly people get stupid. They're like, I don't get it. How can it double in size every few days? I don't understand. There seems to be a massive disconnect. But anyway, you have a plan, Steve Keen, to basically give everybody some money to stay home and stop the spread of the disease. I believe this is already being done in places like China. Tell us more.
This is one case where the capitalist system, which works brilliantly when you try to innovate on a stable base, will break down because there's simply no way that the market system will function through a period where you have to isolate everybody for something like a month. And it's particularly bad now because we have so many people on precarious contracts who they're lucky to have a buffer of 2 weeks of income. They can't afford not to be connected for 4 weeks. We have people paying mortgages when the level of mortgage debt, household debt, compared to what it was back at the time of the last pandemic, which was back in the Spanish flu in 1918, we have 4 times the level of household debt that they had at that stage. So if we went, say, let's go total free market, none of this government nonsense, what would happen is that huge proportions of the population who rent would fail to pay their rent. They would face eviction, which would make the infection worse because they'd be on the streets and passing the disease around. We'd have mortgagees who'd be evicted from their houses. The mortgagors would find that their debts were no longer worthwhile, so they'd need to write down their asset side. We could have a financial contagion that makes the coronavirus far worse. And in that situation, a policy that I have put forward about a decade ago to say we could cure the remnants of the 2008 financial crisis, what I call the modern debt jubilee, that I think is now, I never thought there'd be any chance of this being implemented, but I think now, because we have this potential 1 month break, which we'd need to stop the virus completely, that 1 month break would have to be covered by government giving money to everybody to say, here's enough cash to pay your rent, pay your mortgage, small businesses not to fold when they've got no customers, the restaurants being an obvious example, and state-created money injected into everybody's bank accounts, what Francis Coppola calls people's quantitative easing. That's what we need to get over this crisis. If we don't do it, then the financial effects may be as devastating as the disease itself.
Right. Now you make an interesting point there. We are witnessing central bankers and leaders of the IMF and financiers and people associated with Wall Street go on television and talk about ways to curb the coronavirus by printing money for them, by bailing them out, by giving them more quantitative easing, by lowering interest rates around the world, as we saw at the Fed. The Fed, Steve Mnuchin at the Treasury in the United States says we're going to fight coronavirus by jawboning Jay Powell at the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates by 500 basis points. And to your point, that money could go toward having people stay at home, which would actually curb the virus. By giving bankers more money, and by the way, during these press conferences, they're touching their face, they're blowing their nose, they're spreading the virus during the press conference, begging for more bailout money, when they could just give money to people and stop the spread of coronavirus. This is like 2008. As you said back then, there could have been a quantitative easing for the people, bail out the debtors instead of the creditors. And here we are again in 2020. Instead of bailing out the people that are sick by keeping them home, the response by the kleptocrats is going to be, hey, let's give more money to Jamie Dimon. Again, isn't there a connection? Can't you say that the malfeasance and poor judgment of bailing out the banks in 2008 actually led to the rise of coronavirus by instituting malinvestments around the world And now we have the result of that, Steve Keen.
I wouldn't blame coronavirus on QE, and I wouldn't blame it on global warming, on climate change either. What I'd blame it on is the thing that causes climate change, and that's the human pressure we're putting on the environment, because that is like a parallel cause to what's giving us global warming. Now, we've seen recent studies saying that the mass of animals on the planet, of that mass, 90% of them are either humans or animals that humans breed to eat or use in other fashions. So we've made ourselves the perfect host for a pathogen by putting too much of a strain on the planet. There's no way that a virus is going to survive and prosper by infecting tigers, because we're wiping them out. They're dying out. The host is dying out. So in this case, the classic place for a host to develop is humanity. Now, it isn't, and again, what I see in QE as it's being practiced is yet another ineffective policy by people who are in charge and don't understand the system they're running. And it worked to some extent because the money from QE, which is about $1 trillion a year, dribbled into the real economy, and maybe about $100 billion a year through the salaries and bonuses the finance sector pays itself, the Lamborghinis they purchased, the cleaners they got to clean the Lamborghinis, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a trivial, but nonetheless trivial amount of a large amount that fed into the real economy and gave us some growth, but massively inflated asset prices. But that set us up for a problem now, because the balance sheets of banks and the balance sheets of companies are based heavily on the value of the stock market, which, if this keeps on going, the coronavirus will plunge. And that will mean banks might go bankrupt because their balance sheet can't be pumped up by the Federal Reserve anymore. So we really have to say, look, throw out the ineffective policies, give money to the people directly, which is what they need to get through the 1 month or 2 month isolation they'll need to have. They allow companies to go bankrupt and still function, because we can't enforce the normal rules of the market right now, and directly buy shares, the same way that the Japanese central bank has been doing for some time, buy those shares to support the market rather than giving the money to the finance sector in the hope they'll buy the shares, because at some point they won't. They'll pocket the money and run. And then we're going to have a bit like what happened in Japan. I think the Japanese central banks own 70% of the stock market. That's a better situation than having a stock market crash, a financial failure, the payment system breaking down, and basically we end up not in Max Keiser territory, we end up in Mad Max territory.
Just to follow up on my comment about 2008, because it plays into what you were talking about, environmental pressures lead to coronavirus, going back to 2008 and the bailout of the creditors, that destroyed market signals. It destroyed the ability for the market to communicate through price signals where to effectively allocate funds. In that case, it would have been toward fighting environmental pressures, but that never happened. Hence, we have coronavirus. But let me ask you about the supply chain. Just-in-time globalization has left us helpless in the face of shortages of things like face masks. What should be the response there, Steve?
This is the real problem of modern capitalism compared to the last time we had this crisis, which was the Spanish flu back in the end of the First World War. Back in those days, there are imports and there are exports, but you didn't have to buy large amounts of imports to produce what you were producing in most countries. The supply chain was very short. The manufacturing system was just after the invention, about a decade after the invention of the Model T Ford and the beginning of the production line. And back in those days, what you have is enormous stocks outside the factory, which would be slowly used for the manufacturing. So you had a huge buffer. Now we've gone with what Deming brought in, the remarkable idea for improving manufacturing quality, called the just-in-time system. But what it means is you're incredibly dependent upon precisely timed deliveries because you don't hold many stocks. And on top of that, American capitalism since the 1980s has been taking advantage of cheap labor, particularly in China, of course, and relocating production to third world countries. So even a thing like the Apple iPhone, the ultimate American product, is made in about 30 countries, most of which is China. Now, if you can no longer transport those goods because, for very sensible reasons, seamen will refuse to board ships where they're going to be stuck in confined spaces with 50 or so other people, one of whom might have the virus. By the time they get to the other side, they're all going to have the virus. Some of them could be ill. The ship could end up doing a Jurassic Park and crashing into the wharf on the way, and because the captain's dead. In that situation, the supply chain breaks down completely and manufacturing can cease. it isn't just that China will stop manufacturing because it's quarantining its own people. That will feed through to the American production system and mean goods can't be produced as well. So this is a classic indication of what Nassim Taleb calls the fragility of modern society. We've designed a society which relies upon everything working smoothly, and therefore it fails this test of anti-fragility. And we're going to see the impact of that. And I don't really think there's any way around that. We are going to see a breakdown in the supply chain.
All right, Steve Keen, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max. Great to talk. As I said, it's a terrible topic, but let's get the word out there.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Steve Keen. Check out his Patreon at patreon.com for Prof. Steve Keen. Homeschool yourself. Get smart. Until next time, Max Keiser and Stacy Herbert saying bye, y'all, and check us out on Twitter. It's Keiser Report. Bye.